Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of East of Ethnia. I'd like to talk to you today about historical revisionism in the Balkans. And I guess the first thing that I can say is that there is a lot of it, but I want to kind of trace a little bit of its development and show you the direction that it's pointing. So where do we begin with historical revisionism? I mean, historical revisionism is as old as national myth-making, probably even older than that, because it's connected with pre-national myth-making. I think one of the moments I would trace in the current period that marks historical revisionism is the changing of the story of the Second World War. Now, keeping in mind that during the period of state socialism, there was a mythologized version of the Second World War that was taught, in which a small group of um, invaders and their collaborators were eventually defeated by a massive multi-ethnic popular movement. And this was always an exaggerated story, and it was always open to being debunked. But the way that it got debunked was particular, and I think that probably the story begins in the 1980s in Croatia with a kind of revival of the story of their collaborators, and then when Franjo Tudjman comes to power, the creation of this narrative of equivalence, the idea that both the civilian victims of um, of the Nazis collaborators and the collaborators themselves were victims of the invaders, and that the people who resisted the invaders and their collaborators were victims on the same level as the people that they were fighting against. So this sort of goes back to the story of the 1980s when Ronald Reagan attempts to engage a joint commemoration of both SS soldiers and their victims in Bitburg in Germany. It follows also the narrative that became the official narrative in Spain after the death of Francisco Franco, which put an equivalence between all sides. And what became interesting is after a bit of time, you saw a parallel narrative to the one that developed in Croatia, developing in Serbia, in which they said in this case, both the partisans and the Chetniks, that is to say, both the people fighting against the collaborators and the collaborators themselves were resistance movements. And this was an historical movement that developed through discourse but became commemorated in law, so that now both members of the partisans and members of the collaborationist groups that the partisans were fighting against are commemorated and are eligible for pensions and so forth as members of the resistance. You finally saw a last comer to the game in Bosnia on the Bosniak side, the narrative developing that the groups that had been collaborating with the occupiers during the Second World War were in fact secretly partisans, were contributing to resistance, were only interested in celebrating the soul of the nation and so on. What becomes important in all of these stories is the way in which the resistance fades into the background. The people, individual victims and their lives, fade into the background, and what you get is a national story in which the nation is always innocent, the nation is always a hero. We thought that this would not be repeated in the narratives of the wars of the 1990s, the wars of succession that followed the dissolution of Yugoslavia. But it turns out we were wrong. The reason that we thought this would not happen was that so much information was available and there was so much activism contemporaneous with the violence that it would make denial and revisionism impossible. But here's what I think you've seen happening since the end of the 1990s. The memory activists, the ones interested in mutual recognition and reconciliation and in establishing historical facts, have achieved as much as they can, and their supporters have withdrawn. So their job is effectively, I mean, although you'll still find some people trying to do it, prevented from further development. And what you see instead is an inclination to the development of memory cartels, people with parallel narratives that are one-sided and self-serving and competitive with one another. And what all of these memory cartels do, regardless of what national or ethnic group they claim to be advancing the interests of, is they flatten out the story of victimhood and of suffering, so that eventually it is no longer people who are regarded as suffering, but people as members of groups. And eventually the members of groups are flattened out of the story, and they become stand-ins for the national or ethnic group themselves. So there is a winnowing of the cast of characters. Fewer people, more nations come to be seen as the cast of characters. So as the story comes to be desocialized, it comes to be nationalized, and it comes to be monopolized. So this is what happens over time when the outsiders lose interest, when the activists lose energy, is that the power holders and the people who are the successors to the original promoters of violence come to dominate and establish a monopoly over the story, or the way that another writer put it, the best lose all conviction and the worst continue to be filled with what we have known from the beginning, that they have a passionate intensity. Thank you for listening. Talk to you next week.